This is task 4 of the Canarias Open 2025 and turned out to be my best result of the competition. Complicated task with 14 waypoints. Start gate was the end of the Mala Ridge, about 1 kilometre from takeoff, and the first waypoint out towards Arrieta. We returned to takeoff, then up to Tabayesco before flying downwind to tag turnpoint 4 in the valley and back into wind to Arrieta again. I just managed to tag turnpoint 5 before landing at the beach. The course continued back to takeoff and up to Arrieta again before returning to takeoff and another trip downwind of Tabayesco in the valley, a leg going north past Arrieta and back to takeoff, then heading towards the beach to achieve goal. A tricky task, and only one pilot made it to goal, several pilots landing around turnpoint 5. Very windy on takeoff, wiremen and wingmen needed to keep things under control, but though things looked a little dodgy, the takeoff was quite easy as long as you pushed hard against the wind and kept control of pitch. After only a few seconds you were well above takeoff. I took off in good time to take the first start gate at 13:40, and there was plenty of lift around. It was fairly easy to get high, but tricky to stay high while waiting for the start. I topped out around 2200 feet before the race began, but I set off for the start at about 1800. The sky was pretty busy to race start, but with thermals pushing through regularly, the gliders were fairly well spaced apart. I took the start gate just a few seconds after it opened, and I topped up to nearly 1600 feet on the way to the first turnpoint at Arrieta. This meant I easily made it back to the main ridge on the way to takeoff with plenty height to spare. The sky was pretty busy since many of the gliders in all classes took the first start. Heading back to the ridge there were many gliders both above and below me. It was a great start for me. Back at takeoff for turnpoint 2 the sky was very busy. I think the task setters had set turnpoint 1 away from the ridge to avoid congestion over takeoff, but this didn't seem to have worked that well. There was no danger though, and I found that the density of gliders at this point quite comforting, since it meant that for once I was keeping up with the pack. I think I was overcautious going to turn point 3. I should have taken the turn point, then immediately headed downwind from Tabayesco looking for lift on the 2 ridges on the way to turn point 4. This was the optimal path. Instead, I tagged turn point 3, then returned to the main ridge to gain height so that hopefully I could get to the next turn point without having to search for lift in the valley. This wasted a good 5 to 10 minutes before I headed over the back. The video shows me circling in front of the main ridge, looking at the next turn point and not flying towards it for some reason. It was here that I needed someone to shout, "Hey dog, stop being a divvy and get on with it." Eventually I decided it was okay to go down the valley, and despite all my prep for making this easy, I arrived too low. The turn point is at the top of this slope where the bare earth changes to vegetation. I was still a bit wary of taking this rented glider in too close to the ground, so it took me well over 5 minutes to gain enough height to tag the waypoint. I'd seen gliders thermaling over this ridge all week, but there was nothing around while I was there. After finally tagging turn point 4, I headed back to the main ridge in order to gain height again and look towards turn point 5 at Arrieta. There was very little sink on the way back, so I easily made it to the ridge. Conditions seemed to have degraded, however, and I was down to 1,000 feet with not much thermal activity anymore. I made one attempt hoping for lift over the road into Tabayesco, where I had been lucky a few times before, but it wasn't to be, and I returned to the ridge. Eventually I managed to get to over 1,400 feet and set out. As yesterday, the interwind leg meant a lot of sink, and by the time I tagged the turn point at Arrieta, I was only about 500 feet above ground, so I headed for the beach landing. I think if I hadn't messed around getting to turn point 4, I would have been here 15 minutes earlier when the conditions would have been slightly better, and maybe would have had a decent chance of continuing on the course. The landing was okay. I usually try for a constant angle approach and end up doing a couple of S-turns in the middle because I gauged the approach wrong, but this time it worked out fine. Probably could have made a more solid flare, but I had no problems running off the speed. For some reason I stepped over the base bar just as the glider came to a halt, which tipped the nose down and scratched the lens on my camera. Fortunately, the plastic lens cover saved a glass lens and an expensive fix. Third place on the day was a fantastic result for me, and only 600 metres behind Christoph, who landed out after turnpoint 5 rather than heading for a beach landing. Gary was the only pilot in goal and landed about 10 minutes after me, so obviously didn't mess around like me and use the better conditions earlier on. In the overall scores, this put me in 5th place, just inside the top half of the table, and I was very pleased with that. I've just noticed the results table shows me with an Avian Puma, but I was actually flying a Willswing U2.